Nintendo started as a small card shop back in the late 1800s, and no one could have imagined that decades later, this little Kyoto business would become the most powerful name in gaming. They rose to dominance in the 1980s by seizing the moment after the Atari crash, rebuilding the gaming industry almost from scratch. The NES wasn't just a hit console, it was the console that brought video games back to life. From there came the Game Boy, the SNES, the Wii, and many different cultural diverse titles that defined entire generations of gaming. But for every beloved memory, there's a darker side to Nintendo's story. Ruthless business tactics, exclusivity deals, courtroom fights with Blockbuster, betrayals like the failed partnership with Sony, and now, modern controversies, $70 and $80 games, disappearing digital libraries, and subscription models fans love to hate. This is the journey of Nintendo, from a small family shop to the empire that saved gaming to a company fans now criticize more than ever. Long before Mario and the NES, Nintendo wasn't even in the video game business. The company's roots actually go all the way back to 1889, when Fusajiro Yamauchi opened a small shop in Kyoto, Japan. What did they sell? Not consoles, and not toys. They sold playing cards, specifically Hanafuda cards used for traditional Japanese games. For decades, Nintendo survived as a regional card company, but the market was small and competitive. And in the 1950s, they faced a crossroad. Fusajiro's great-grandson, Hiroshi, took over as the president in 1949, and at just 22 years old, Hiroshi was ruthless, ambitious, and determined to turn Nintendo into more than just a dusty card manufacturer. He modernized the company, signed a licensing deal with Disney to put Mickey Mouse on Nintendo playing cards, and for the first time, Nintendo became a household name across Japan, and by the 1960s, Nintendo was the largest card manufacturer in the country. But Hiroshi wasn't satisfied. He wanted to expand, even if it meant taking wild risks. During the 1960s, Nintendo experimented with just about everything. Instant rice, a taxi company, even love hotels. And while most of these ventures failed, one department stood out: toys. Under engineer Gunpei Yokoi, Nintendo created clever mechanical toys like the Ultra Hand, and later the Light Gun series. These weren't blockbusters, but they proved something important. Nintendo had the creativity and engineering talent to compete in the entertainment space. As the 1970s arrived, Nintendo followed the global trend towards electronics, and they launched arcade machines, entering the coin-op business at a time when Japan's gaming scene was exploding. One of their first big successes was Ever Race, a horse racing arcade game. But the real turning point came in 1981 when a young artist named Shigeru Miyamoto designed Donkey Kong. It was a smash hit in arcades worldwide, and it introduced two characters who would define Nintendo forever: Donkey Kong and a certain carpenter named Jumpman, who was later renamed as Mario. At this point, Nintendo had gone from a small Kyoto card shop to an international arcade sensation. But their biggest challenge and their biggest opportunity was yet to come. In the early 1980s, the video game market in America was collapsing. Atari was falling apart, retailers were abandoning games, and the future of the entire industry was in question. And Nintendo was about to step in. By the early 1980s, video games weren't just popular, they were everywhere. Atari's 2600 turned gaming into a cultural phenomenon, but this golden age wasn't built to last. During this time period, the industry had no guardrails. Anyone could publish a cartridge, and many rushed games to the market with no quality control. Infamous examples like Pac-Man for the 2600 and the disastrous E.T. game shipped millions of copies, but were borderline unplayable. And eventually, retailers were flooded with unsellable inventory, and the customer confidence collapsed. This period became known as the Atari Shock. To put into perspective how big this collapse was, between 1983 and 1985, the US video game industry lost nearly 97% of its value. Atari, once the fastest growing company in America, was in shambles. retailers refused to stock new consoles, declaring video games a dead trend. And by 1984, the message was clear. In North America, the video game market was finished. But while America's gaming industry was imploding, Japan's was actually thriving. In 1983, Nintendo had launched the Famicom, short for Family Computer. It was affordable, reliable, and backed by hit titles like Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. But when Nintendo tried to bring it to the US, retailers wanted nothing to do with it. After all, video games were quote-unquote dead. So how did Nintendo react? Well, they disguised the console as something new, a family entertainment system and not a game console. And to convince skeptical retailers, Nintendo also rebranded the Famicom as the Nintendo Entertainment System. And instead of selling it as a console, they packaged it with peripherals like Rob the Robot, making it look more like a toy or a VCR than another failed gaming system. As I'm going back and I'm editing this part of Nintendo's history, it never clicked in my head when I was a kid, and it kind of makes sense because you're a fucking kid, you don't know anything. But I didn't realize until now that the gun in Duck Hunt that you used to shoot the ducks. I didn't realize until now that that was actually a marketing gimmick so the NES could be sold as a toy and not a video game console. This was one of the things that they did specifically so they could get it in retailers in the US, because retailers at the time were obviously terrified of video games after the Atari collapse, which is really interesting. They also launched the now iconic Nintendo Seal of Quality, which was their golden stamp of approval in marketing. Unlike Atari, Nintendo also promised that every game would meet strict standards, and that assurance gave retailers enough confidence to take the gamble.
Nintendo Entertainment System, the one to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot, batteries not included. He helps you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate zapper?
In 1985, the NES launched in a limited rollout in New York City. Nintendo personally hand-led the promotions, and they even offered to stock the shelves on consignment so retailers didn't have to take on risk. And this strategy actually worked. By the time the NES went nationwide in 1986, it was a smash hit. Super Mario Bros. Became a household name, and both kids and families across America were hooked. Within just a few years, Nintendo had flopped the narrative. Video games weren't dead. They were reborn, and Nintendo was in total control. But Nintendo's revival of the industry came with strings attached. They hadn't just saved gaming, they'd rewritten the rules of who could make games, and how. Through lockout chips, licensing contracts, and an iron grip on third-party developers, Nintendo turned the NES into not just a console, but a closed ecosystem. And the next chapter of Nintendo's rise would show how far they were willing to go to maintain control. Inside every NES was a small microchip called 10NES. Think of it as a digital lock. Every licensed cartridge contained a matching key. If the cartridge didn't match, the console simply refused to play it. This was revolutionary. In the Atari era, anyone could make and sell a cartridge, leading to a flood of shovelware. Nintendo's lockout system eliminated that problem, but it also gave Nintendo something far more valuable: absolute control over who could publish games for their system. To publish on the NES, developers had to sign contracts with Nintendo, and those contracts were notoriously one-sided. Publishers were limited to 5 games a year. Nintendo controlled cartridge manufacturing, meaning publishers had to buy production directly from Nintendo, often at high prices. And many contracts included multi-year exclusivity, meaning a game couldn't be released on rival consoles for years. If you wanted access to Nintendo's massive ecosystem, you essentially had no choice but to play by their rules. Some publishers tried to get a little creative with this. Konami, for example, created a fake sub-label called Ultra Games, which allowed them to bypass the 5-game limit by publishing under 2 names. It was a clever trick, but it just showed how restrictive Nintendo's policies really were. But others weren't willing to bend the knee. Atari's offshoot, Tengen, attempted to bypass Nintendo's lockout system entirely. They reverse-engineered the 10NES chip illegally by obtaining a copy of its code from the US Copyright Office, and began producing their own unlicensed NES cartridges. And for a brief moment, Tengen was the rebellion, releasing games like Tetris and Gauntlet without Nintendo's approval. But Nintendo struck hard, lawsuits flew, and in 1992 the courts sided with Nintendo, ruling that Tengen's use of the 10NES code was copyright infringement. And from here, the message was clear. If you wanted to go around Nintendo, they would try to crush you in court. These tactics gave Nintendo unprecedented leverage, and by 1989, over 90% of the video game market ran through Nintendo. Developers, retailers, even rental companies were all subject to Nintendo's rules. And while fans celebrated classics like Zelda and Mega Man, behind the scenes, Nintendo's business practices were raising eyebrows among regulators. The company wasn't just shaping the future of video games, it was starting to look like a monopoly. Control had made Nintendo untouchable, but it had also made them enemies. And soon, those enemies wouldn't just be developers, they'd include the Federal Trade Commission, 39 US states, and even Blockbuster Video. By the early 90s, Nintendo was the king of the gaming market, but that power came with scrutiny, and regulators were circling. The FTC and even Congress began questioning whether Nintendo's licensing practices and pricing strategies were legal, and Nintendo was accused of artificially fixing cartridge prices and using its dominance to squeeze both consumers and developers. In 1991, the company settled with the FTC and 39 state attorney generals. Nintendo agreed to pay out the equivalent of $25 million in coupons to millions of NES owners, and another $5 million directly to the states. And this actually became, and still is to this day, one of the largest antitrust settlements in the history of video games. And it showed that Nintendo's iron grip wasn't going unnoticed. But Nintendo's control didn't stop with developers and retailers. They also set their sights on the booming video rental industry. And by the late 90s, companies like Blockbusters were making serious money renting out NES games for just a few dollars a night. For parents, this was a godsend. Instead of buying a $50 cartridge, kids could try games for a fraction of the price. Nintendo, however, saw rentals as a direct threat. If families could rent Super Mario Bros. 3 for a few dollars, why would they buy it for $50? And Nintendo executives argued that rentals hurt sales and undermined the quality standards Nintendo worked so hard to build. So what did Nintendo do? Well, they lobbied Congress. In the late 80s, Nintendo pushed hard for new laws that would outlaw video game rentals altogether. At one hearing, Nintendo executives argued that, unlike films, games weren't designed for a single sitting. They said renting a game for the weekend was effectively the same as owning it, which meant rental stores were robbing developers of their livelihood. But the lobbying failed. Congress was not convinced that the rentals were piracy, and just like that, Nintendo's dream of banning rentals nationwide collapsed. Still, Nintendo wasn't done. In 1989, they sued Blockbuster directly. Nintendo went after Blockbuster for photocopying game manuals. There is a pretty common trend in the late 80s and 90s where if you rented a game, the game manual was usually missing. Blockbuster's way to mitigate this was photocopying the manuals. But Nintendo argued that this was copyright infringement. Blockbuster was forced to stop producing copies, and from then on, rentals came with the original manuals or nothing at all. This case might seem minor, but it was part of a larger pattern and a trend for Nintendo. See, Nintendo fought for control at every step, from pricing to licensing to even instruction booklets. They didn't want a single corner of their ecosystem slipping out of their hands or their control. And ironically, their war against rentals may have backfired, because renting games didn't destroy sales at all. If anything, it introduced kids to more Nintendo games. But the fight cemented Nintendo's reputation as a company that would rather go to court than lose control. After the battle with Blockbuster, Nintendo was still the undisputed king of gaming, and the Super Nintendo was holding strong against Sega's Genesis. But behind the scenes, Nintendo was already looking to the future, and that future, they thought, was CDs. This is when Nintendo turned to a trusted partner, Sony. The two companies struck a deal to create a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. Sony would supply the hardware, and Nintendo would control the games. The project was called the SNES CD, and it promised massive storage compared to cartridges. Games like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest could be bigger, more cinematic, and loaded with audio and video that cartridges simply just couldn't handle. In 1991, Sony proudly took to the stage at CES to announce the partnership, and there they unveiled the prototype, a hybrid console that could play both SNES cartridges and new CD-based titles, and it was going to be called the Nintendo PlayStation. But there was a catch, and it was buried under the fine print. Under the deal, Sony would have full control over licensing and royalties for all CD-based games on the new system, and to Nintendo, that was just unacceptable. They had spent years building their empire on exclusivity and licensing fees, and suddenly, Sony would be taking a cut? I don't think so. Behind the scenes, Hiroshi Yamauchi and Nintendo's leadership started to panic, and they quietly began negotiating another partner, Philips. And while Sony was prepared to show off their new console to the world, Nintendo was preparing for a public betrayal. Sony announced the PlayStation to an excited audience, but the very next morning, Nintendo dropped a bombshell. Without warning Sony, they announced a brand new partnership with Philips, abandoning Sony on the spot. And this was honestly one of the most shocking moments in gaming history. Sony executives were blindsided, and journalists couldn't even believe it. Overnight, the Nintendo-Sony partnership was dead. For Sony, the betrayal was humiliating, but it was also a turning point. And rather than walking away, they doubled down. Engineers inside Sony, led by Ken Kutaragi, reworked the prototype into a standalone console, and the Nintendo PlayStation transformed into the Sony PlayStation. 4 years later, in 1994, the PlayStation launched in Japan, and by the end of the decade, it was outselling the Nintendo 64's 2-1. What began as Nintendo's attempt to control a partner actually instead created their greatest rival. But what about Nintendo's new partnership with Philips? That deal was actually a train wreck. The deal only produced a handful of games, and all of them were disasters. The infamous Zelda Wand of Gamelon and Zelda Faces of Evil for the Philips CD essentially just became jokes among fans. And while Sony soared with PlayStation, Nintendo's betrayal left them with nothing but embarrassment. In one move, Nintendo had alienated Sony, handed the world its most powerful competitor, and tarnished its reputation in the process. Although Nintendo was still strong, the seeds of their decline had already been planted at this point, and their next decisions would drive third-party developers away in droves. By the mid-1990s, the console wars were heating up. Sega was pushing CDs with the Saturn, and Sony entered the market with the brand new PlayStation. For Nintendo, this was the moment to prove that they were still the leader of the industry. But one fateful decision would cost them dearly. While the rest of the industry embraced CDs, Nintendo doubled down on cartridges, and the reasoning made sense. At least to them. Cartridges loaded faster, they were harder to pirate, and Nintendo could keep tighter control over manufacturing. The issue is that there was a massive trade-off: cost and capacity. A single CD could store 650 megabytes, while a Nintendo 64 cartridge maxed out at 64 megabytes, a tenth of the storage. And manufacturing cartridges cost publishers up to $30 per unit, compared to just a few dollars for CDs. And the decision to stick with cartridges alienated third-party developers who were tired of Nintendo's restrictions. Squaresoft, one of Nintendo's biggest allies, had actually been developing Final Fantasy VII for the Nintendo 64, but the massive size of the game made cartridges impossible, and this is where Squaresoft made a historic decision. They abandoned Nintendo and brought Final Fantasy VII to Sony's PlayStation, spreading the story across 3 CDs. And if you grew up with Final Fantasy VII like I did, then you know that it became one of the best-selling and most iconic RPGs of all time. But Square wasn't alone. Enix, Capcom, Konami, and Namco were tired of Nintendo's shit, and major publishers left for Sony's cheaper, more flexible platform. To be fair, the Nintendo 64 wasn't a failure, and it's still a great console. I still have one myself, with some of the most beloved games on the system, such as Super Mario 64, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Banjo-Kazooie. Actually, if you look at the catalog of Nintendo 64 games, most of them weren't just hits, they defined entire genres of gaming. But while Nintendo was thriving on first-party magic, Sony was building their own platform. When the parents went to the store, the math was simple. PlayStation games costed less, looked better, and there was just more of them. During this period of the console war, the results were actually pretty brutal. The Nintendo 64 roughly sold around 33 million units worldwide, which is respectable, but a steep drop from the NES and the SNES. Meanwhile, Sony's PlayStation 1 sold over 100 million units, making it the dominant console of the generation. By the early 2000s, Nintendo was in trouble. They had lost their third-party support, and Sony's PlayStation was dominating the market, and Sega had to bow out of the console war entirely after the Dreamcast. The new battlefield now belonged to three players: Sony, Nintendo, and a surprising new rival, Microsoft with its Xbox. Nintendo's answer was the Gamecube, released in 2001. It was powerful, colorful, and affordable at just $199. But Nintendo once again chose a proprietary format, mini discs with around just 1.5 gigabytes of storage, compared to the PlayStation 2's full DVDs at 4.7 gigs, and this caused limited third-party support yet again. Publishers just preferred Sony's PS2, which was not only more flexible for development, but also doubled as a DVD player, a massive selling point for families at the time. The GameCube sold around 22 million units worldwide, compared to the PS2, which sold over 155 million worldwide. Despite great games like Metroid Prime, Wind Waker, and Smash Bros. Melee, gamers just preferred Sony and Xbox. Faced with irrelevance, Nintendo decided not to fight Sony and Microsoft on power, but on accessibility, and in 2006, they unveiled the Wii. Instead of high-end graphics, it focused on motion controls, and instead of a heavy price tag, it launched at just $250, where instead of fighting over the same hardcore market, they would expand the audience to families, grandparents, and people who'd never touched a controller before. Surprisingly, this gamble actually paid off. Bundled with Wii Sports, the Wii became a family hit, and it's because it wasn't just for kids. Nursing homes would host Wii bowling tournaments, families competed in living rooms, and even late-night talk shows started showing off the new system. By 2010, the Wii had sold over 100 million units, outselling both the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, and for the first time since the NES, Nintendo wasn't just back, they were on top of the world again. But the Wii's success had a cost. Third-party developers specifically struggled to find an audience on the platform, as most Wii owners bought only a handful of casual titles, like Wii Sports and Just Dance. And with the lack of titles, core gamers started to grow frustrated with weaker graphics and shovelware flooding the market. For all of its success, the Wii was a bubble, and once it popped, Nintendo would face one of its darkest chapters yet. The Wii had proven that Nintendo could reinvent the market, but it had also highlighted their oldest weaknesses: third-party isolation, reliance on first-party titles, and short-lived trends. The next decade would be defined not just by innovation, but by Nintendo's increasingly aggressive efforts to control players, developers, and even their own fans. By the 2010s, Nintendo had weathered the ups and downs of the Wii era. The DS was a global hit, the 3DS found its footing, and the Switch was on the horizon. But while Nintendo's hardware evolved, their philosophy of control never changed, and if anything, it got worse. One of the clearest examples came in 2018 when Nintendo went after two of the largest ROM distribution sites, Love ROMs and Love Retro. These sites hosted downloadable copies of classic Nintendo games. Games that in many cases were no longer commercially available. And what did Nintendo do when they found out? Nothing new. Nintendo sued the operators for copyright infringement, demanding damages of up to $150,000 per game. Facing bankruptcy, the site owners settled for a staggering $12 million. The sites were then shut down, and the case sent shockwaves through the preservation community. And shortly after, other ROM hubs quickly went offline, fearing Nintendo's lawyers would come knocking next. But Nintendo didn't stop at ROMs. In 2024, they also set their sights on emulation itself. The target was Yuzu, a popular Switch emulator capable of running games like Tears of the Kingdom on PC. Nintendo sued the developers, claiming the emulator facilitated piracy. The case ended in a $2.4 million settlement, Yuzu shut down, and its website and repositories were permanently taken offline. For many fans, this was a chilling message. Nintendo wasn't just fighting piracy, they were fighting tools used to preserve their games. Even content creators weren't safe. In 2015, Nintendo introduced the Nintendo Creators Program, which required YouTubers and streamers to register with Nintendo and share advertising revenue just to show gameplay footage. It was completely unprecedented. Other publishers saw creators as free marketing, but Nintendo saw them as revenue streams. Fans and influencers pushed back hard, accusing Nintendo of silencing coverage, and the backlash got so bad that by 2018, Nintendo shut the program down. But even after that, their strict guidelines still continued, with takedowns targeting music uploads, mods, and fan projects. Nintendo's hardware quality came under fire as well. Everybody remembers the infamous Joy-Con drift. For those uninitiated, over time, the controller's analog sticks would register movement when not touched. And this issue sparked lawsuits around the world, and eventually Nintendo would offer free repairs if you would ship them in. But the damage was done. For the first time, fans were openly criticizing Nintendo, not just for their business practices, but for their products. And as all of this compounded, it painted a very different picture of Nintendo. For decades, they'd been the smiling family brand, the company of Mario, Pokemon, and Zelda. But now, they're also seen as litigious, aggressive, and quick to crush anything that they could not control, whether it was ROM archivists, emulator developers, or even YouTubers. Nintendo's message was clear. This is our brand, and you can only participate on our terms. This enforcement era also revealed another side to Nintendo's empire. Behind the colorful games and family-friendly branding, it was a corporation that guarded its IP with ruthless precision. But Nintendo's control wasn't limited to lawsuits. It also extended something even more fundamental: ownership. And in the next chapter, fans would discover how little control they really had over the games they bought. By the 2020s, Nintendo's aggression reached beyond fans into the wider industry. In 2024, they took aim at Palworld, a survival game often described as Pokemon with guns. Nintendo and the Pokemon Company reportedly launched investigations into the game, sparking a heated debate online. Was Palworld inspired by Pokemon, a ripoff, or simply just competition that Nintendo wanted to crush? And so what did Nintendo do? They took him to court. And as of today, there is still an ongoing battle between Palworld's development team, Pocket Pair, and Nintendo. But honestly, I find their new patent much stranger. Nintendo filed a patent covering a game mechanic where players summon characters to fight in battle, something that everybody finds suspicious. And many critics have argued that patents like this could stifle innovation, blocking developers from creating features that had been common in RPGs for decades. For many, it looked like another example of Nintendo not just protecting their games, but even the very ideas behind them. They were no longer the family-friendly company behind Mario and Zelda. Instead, they were the corporation shutting down Smash Bros. Tournaments, attacking fan communities, investigating competitors, and even patenting gameplay concepts themselves. But Nintendo wasn't finished. Their next step extended beyond communities, and it was baked into the very way Nintendo sold its games. Because in the digital era, fans discovered a hard truth. When you buy a Nintendo game, you don't actually own it. Nintendo's battles with fans, tournaments, and emulators had revealed their obsession with control. But for ordinary consumers, that control wasn't just about lawsuits. it was about ownership itself. For decades, video games were physical, either cartridges or discs you could hold, trade, or sell. But as digital storefronts became the norm, Nintendo quietly reshaped the terms. When you buy a game digitally, what you're purchasing isn't ownership, it's a license. And that license exists as long as Nintendo maintains the server. On March 27, 2023, Nintendo shut down both the Wii U and the 3DS eShops. And overnight, thousands of games, including indie titles, virtual console classics, and DLC packs, became unobtainable. Players who had already bought them can still re-download for now, but nobody knows for how long. And once those servers go offline for good, entire libraries will vanish forever. And then came Nintendo Switch Online. For a monthly fee, players gained access to classic NES, SNES, Nintendo 64, and even Game Boy titles. But the catch was pretty clear: stop paying and you lose access. And sadly, beloved games like Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon Snap were now subscription perks. And it wasn't just access, it was price. In 2023, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom launched at $70, the highest base price ever for a Nintendo game in the US market. Nintendo insisted that it was a reflection of value, not a permanent new standard, but fans knew what it meant. For decades, Nintendo resisted the industry's price hikes. Now, they're becoming the pioneers. If we take the last few things that we just got done talking about and put it together, the games you buy digitally are just licenses, the libraries you love can vanish overnight when storefronts close, classics are locked behind monthly subscriptions, and even their physical cartridges are increasingly tied to digital updates that could disappear in the future. This isn't ownership, it's access, controlled by Nintendo on Nintendo's terms. For over 135 years, Nintendo has shaped entertainment, from a Kyoto card shop in 1889 to the gray box that revived gaming in 1985, to the handhelds and hybrids that became cultural hits. Nintendo isn't just a company, it's a part of history. But the same company that gave us Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon has also shut down fan tournaments, crashed emulator projects, and now, with the Switch 2, has pushed players into an era of $80 games being the norm. Nintendo's heroic side is obvious. They resurrected the industry after the Atari crash. They pioneered genres, set standards for design, and created characters recognized around the globe. The NES, the SNES, and Wii weren't just consoles, they were cultural revolutions. Even today, Nintendo still creates experiences that nobody else can replicate. Breath of the Wild redefined open-world design, Tears of the Kingdom pushed creativity in ways players never imagined, and the Switch, with its hybrid portability, became one of the best-selling consoles of all time. And if the story ended there, Nintendo would be remembered as the savior of gaming. But their villain arc is just as undeniable. The 10NES lockout chip, exclusivity contracts, the lawsuit against Blockbuster, the betrayal of Sony, the exodus of third-party developers, and decades of courtroom battles. In the modern era, it's gone further. Nintendo has shut down grassroots Smash Bros. Tournaments. They sued ROM sites into oblivion. They killed emulators like Yuzu. They tied Pokemon and classic titles to subscriptions. And they made ownership itself look like an illusion. And now, with the Switch 2, they've cemented themselves as pioneers of $80 gaming, not following the industry, but leading it. They even charged players for a paid welcome tour to the Switch 2, while Sony gave Astro's Playroom away for free when the PS5 launched. And to many, the Switch 2 doesn't feel like a fresh start, it feels like final proof of Nintendo valuing profit over players. The Switch 2 era has also sparked something rare for Nintendo: organized resistance, boycott campaigns, and comment sections flooding with "drop the price." Archivists are calling out their new game key cards as unpreservable, and even longtime fans are questioning whether the magic is still worth the cost. Nintendo hasn't faced this cultural backlash in decades, and whether they bend the knee or double down could shape their legacy for an entire generation. So is Nintendo the hero who saved gaming, or the villain who taught the industry how to control it? Truth is, they're both. They're the company that makes childhood memories and the company that squeezes those same fans years later. And maybe that's why Nintendo endures. Because despite the lawsuits, the prices, and controversies, there will still be fans who will play their games, fans who will line up for midnight launches, and fans who will still buy Mario, Pokemon, and Zelda for decades plus. Nintendo knows this, and in the end, their true power comes not from the games they make, but from the fact that fans keep showing up. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, drop a comment below of your favorite Nintendo memory. Also, if you enjoy gaming history, like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. This is West Coast Ninja, signing out. I will see you in the next video.